Ted Fleming. I'm Pierre-Michel Forget. Well, we know each other for quite a long time. I feel like I'm your little emeritus somehow. So, but tell me about the beginning of your own story.
Well, my own story started in January of 1966 when I went to Panama as a graduate student hired by the Smithsonian Institution to study mammal ecology for a year and a half. And so going to Panama at that time precluded my attending the 1966 OTS course, which I was planning to do. So it wasn't until 1970 that I really became associated with OTS. But in Panama, I just completely fell in love with two groups of organisms, rodents and leaf-nosed bats. And I had support ultimately for rodent population ecology, both in Panama and then in Costa Rica. But it was the bats that I was really interested in. And in about 1974, after I'd worked in Costa Rica for a few years, I dropped the rodent work and became a full-time batman.
So you were lost for rodents?
Yes, I was lost for rodents, but nonetheless, I still have a warm spot in my heart for heteromyid rodents, lyomes and heteromes in the tropical forests, and then I live in the Sonoran Desert now, so that I have heteromyid rodents, the desert rodents, living in my property all the time, so they're still there.
But you don't have frugivorous bats in your backyard?
In my backyard, I don't. In Tucson, Arizona, I don't have frugivorous bats, but I do have, from about mid-August to mid-October, I have my favorite bat of all, the nectar-feeding bat, Leptonictris bourboini, which I studied for 10 years very intensely in Sonora, Mexico. It comes into my yard to feed at hummingbird feeders. So I have a connection with this bat still. They don't know I'm retired.
So back to Costa Rica and Panama.
Indeed.
So when did you start to be interested in pollinating or seed dispersing bats?
Well, the cool thing about working with phyllostomid bats is that when you catch them, they poop out seeds. And so you've got a record of their diet right there. You don't have to kill the bats. Although in Panama, I have to admit that we did actually kill the bats and preserve them for reproductive studies, which actually were very valuable. But nonetheless, once I learned the basic reproduction of these animals, then I didn't have to kill any. I could mark them, release them, get a poop sample or a pollen sample, and let them go their way. So very early on, I became interested in this bat-plant interaction. Nobody had really studied it very carefully, so I was lucky enough to be at the right place and the right time to become a pioneer in the study of bat-plant interactions.
So you've been studying mostly small seeds that are dispersed by bats, but have you looked at those large seeds that are also very interesting for rodents?
Yes, I know. There's that whole group of large seeded trees that bats are really too small to be major dispersers of. So most of my career on seed dispersal was dealing with small seeded fruits and often early successional plants that were the favorites of Corollia bats in the understory and figs, favorites of Artibius bats in the canopy of the trees, but all small seeded taxa.
So with OTS, did you contribute to courses since the beginning? When did you really integrated the group?
Right. Well, my first NSF grant was through OTS, and it got me to Costa Rica for a year and a half in 1970-71. And so I was working through OTS. I went to the office and met the famous Jorge Campa Badal, who was the Costa Rican director of OTS, a very iconic person. And Gary Hortzhorn took me to two study sites the OTS study sites in Costa Rica, La Selva and Palo Verde, as potential places for at that time I was still doing rodents, so rodent and bat work. And so then in 70-71, Gordon Orions did a course on vertebrate ecology through OTS, and I was a resource person with that course. And so that was my first teaching experience with OTS.
Can you tell us what were the condition, the field condition in this time in Palo Verde, in La Selva? Because now it's very fancy, but how was it at this time?
In 1970, in the summer of 1970, we drove into Palo Verde, and the field station was hardly habitable, and it was full of mosquitoes. The swamp there is terribly full of mosquitoes in the summertime, and so I was told that during most of the wet season you're going to have to fly in. You can't drive in because the road is too bad. And I began to have second thoughts. I don't want to be in a place where I can't move around very much, to go to different sites for bat netting, for example. So I actually dropped Palo Verde as a field site and went back to La Pacifica, which is only as the crow flies, or as the bat flies, only 10 or 20 miles away from Palo Verde, but was much more comfortable living, and it's a place where I could drive to different field sites. And so instead of working at Palo Verde, I chose La Pacifica, as many other OTS researchers did at that time. La Selva was a different story because I went to La Selva with Gary Hartshorn. He was just doing his doctoral studies on pennycleather trees. And he took me to the University of Washington in intensive study areas. They had three plots at that time. And one of the plots in intensive study area 1 seemed very ratty to me, like an ideal place to set my trapping grid. And so I chose La Selva as my wet forest site, La Pacifica as my dry forest site. And I was doing comparative population ecology of rodents in the two forests, testing R&K theory that Robert MacArthur and Edward E.O. Wilson had proposed a few years earlier.
So how long have you been studying in those forests? How many years?
Well, initially I studied for almost a year and a half in those two forests, and then I came back the summer of '72 to finish up. So it was really only a period of 2 years. And then by then I had teamed up with a young Stanford graduate student by the name of Ray Heithaus, and a postdoc of Herbert Baker studying plants by the name of Paul Oppler. And we did a bat plant study, a very thorough bat plant study at La Pacifica. And Ray and I decided we wanted to continue to work together. So in '74, we began working at Santa Rosa National Park, up the road from La Pacifica. And I worked there for 10 years, studying bat-plant interactions exclusively. By then, NSF had told me, we'll support your bat-plant work. We're not so keen to support your rodent population work, which I still was really interested in trying to do. But when they tell you one thing, we'll give you money for this, you've got to go that route.
And then, beside Costa Rica, have you been working in other countries, in Central America, in South America?
Well, in the ensuing years, I worked in Costa Rica for almost 17 years, so that was the primary focus. But then I had graduate students from other countries, so I would visit their study sites in Venezuela, in Brazil, and in Mexico. But it wasn't until 1989 that I really began to do serious field work in Mexico in the Sonoran Desert, in pollination biology of giant cacti. So I was pretty much a Central American researcher, and I was planning to go back to Costa Rica after a year's sabbatical in Australia. I studied bat-plant interactions in Australia for a year. But NSF said, we want you to revise your proposal to work at La Selva for another 3 or 4 years. And before I got a chance to revise it, I was asked by Merlin Tuttle, the founder of Bat Conservation International, to come with him with National Geographic support to do experimental studies with pollination biology of giant cacti by bats and other organisms. So once I got to the desert, then I was hooked.
When I listen to you, I'm the impression that I'm reading my literature, all these names from the 80s. It looks like it's my roots, personally. And you mentioned Mexico. How did you decide to organize this group of frugivores addict person with Alessandro Estrada in Los Tuxtlas?
Oh, that was
How
fun.
did it happen?
How did that happen? Well, at the time in 1984, I was still working in Costa Rica and was intending to work in Costa Rica for the foreseeable. And I was really interested in going to Las Tuxtlas because I'd read a lot about Las Tuxtlas, and I contacted Alex Estrada and went there for about a week during my spring break. And we were sitting around lunch one day, and he said, "What do you think about the idea of getting some people that share a common interest with us in seed dispersal? Let's have a conference." And so it was that casual in the initial organization. He just mentioned, and I said, "It's a great idea." And so we put the wheels in motion, and in 1985, in the summer, we met with these people at the field station at Los Tuxtlas, and we had a wonderful time. It was a wonderful conference with a lot of young, enthusiastic Mexican graduate students, young, enthusiastic American graduate students, and some of us more experienced people, and all the names were there. But we tried to get an international representation, but there weren't all that many people at that time working in seed dispersal in the tropics.
How many at the time? Most of these people were working in Central America and in Europe?
Yes. Historically, the main places that North Americans were interested in working were either Barro, Colorado, and Panama, or else the OTS field stations. Those were the most convenient places to work for us in the late 60s, early 70s, and so forth. That has completely changed, of course, in the ensuing 25 years after 1985. But at that time, it was a very restricted group of people working in a very restricted series of locations.
So you really planted the seeds for this new generation of frugivorous addict person, as I am now.
Yes, exactly. We planted the seeds. The initial, as I said, desire was to get as broad a representation of people working in different areas in the tropics. But just through history and so forth, some people were available, some people were not. But since then, it's really blossomed, obviously.
So it was a success because you organized a second one.
We organized a second one in the December of 1988. I returned to Catemaco and to Las Tuxtlas, and my family was with me this time. They had not been to that part of Mexico yet. They'd been to other parts, and we drove on a muddy road for 30 kilometers. It took us 3 hours to get from Catemaco, the end of the paved road, to the field station at Las Tuxtlas. But then Alex and I began to plan the next meeting, which took place in 1991, again in Catemaco rather than at Las Tuxtlas. But it had a broader representation of people working around the world on seed dispersal at that point. So, the field was growing, but it hadn't really taken off as it has in time since then. I think the lasting message from my work is the importance of bats as forest regenerators, bringing seeds into disturbed lands, bringing the pioneer seeds that set the stage for secondary forest succession. Yeah, I've never really worked with primary forest plants. Even at La Selva, in the period 1970 to 71, I was netting bats, but they were hard to catch. Conditions were terrible. It's muddy. There were no facilities really to speak of at La Selva. And so it wasn't as much fun working there as at La Pacifica, where it was more comfortable. I had friends to work with, Paul and Ray, and so I just said, I'm not interested in working in the primary forest at La Selva. It's too difficult at this stage, so I'm going to concentrate on the easier stuff in the dry forest. And I've always been a dry forest person. Physiologically, I'm not that comfortable under constantly wet, raining, buggy conditions.
Did you discover new species of bats?
No, I was never after new species. I can't even think of whether I discovered new location records. I was never interested in that. I've always been an ecologist. And so I've taken what's there and worked with it. And I've worked with the common species like Carolia perspicillata. I was at a mammal meeting once, and one of my colleagues said, "Why are you working with that bat? It's a weed. It's just everywhere. It can't be interesting." Well, it is an interesting bat. And so, my advice to young graduate students is work with an animal that's easy to work with. Don't knock yourself out. And so if it's a common animal, most tropical animals aren't well known, even in this day and age. And so we can learn a lot about general processes of whatever you're interested in, pollination or seed dispersal, working with common organisms. And that's kind of what I've done in most of my career.
So bats is a very ancient group, and how important throughout the time are they for plants and for other animals eventually? You summarize all this in this book, The Ornament of Life, that's coming out. So.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, a new book is coming out. It's my magnum opus. It's actually my 7th book. This one is co-authored with John Kress, the executive director of ATBC. John and I have been friends for a very long time. We work very well together. And this book kind of puts together my view and our view of plant-animal coevolution between vertebrates that either pollinate or disperse the seeds of tropical plants, subtropical plants. And it's very comprehensive. It's about 600 pages long. It's got beautiful pictures, and it tells a very complete synthetic story. So it's going to be my lasting legacy for tropical biology, is the culmination of my 30 or 40 years of thinking about this in a broad biogeographic historical context.
I'm already here. I'm waiting for it with impatience.
Yes. Me too.
To me, major question is, what would you say to the young generation, not me, the one behind us, you
That's
and
right.
I.
Well, new
new
students,
one.
for example.
Yeah.
At this stage in my life and at the culmination of my research, I'm really interested in the conservation of these interactions. As I've talked about in various international meetings recently, my concern is loss of biodiversity, loss of these connections between plants and their pollinators and dispersers. Young people should pay more attention than we did early on in our careers to the conservation implications and getting the word out that we have to conserve these ornaments of life. They're too valuable for the basic economy of tropical forests. Take out the bats, take out the hummingbirds, take out the primates, and you've altered the dynamics of tropical forests in a very profound way.
Because also bats are really important for rodents. They're dispersing some big fruits that are needed for rodents. So
Indeed.
If we lose the bats, we also lose some food for
Indeed,
rodents.
there are cascading effects. I agree. There are cascading effects. If you take out one group or sometimes even a single species, and that's going to have negative repercussions through many species in the same system. It's particularly obvious in the desert, where I worked with the importance of one species of bat as a pollinator of giant columnar cacti. Cacti in these habitats are keystone species. Many species of plants and animals depend on them for their basic reproductive success and ecology. Take out the bat, and you've knocked out the reproductive success of these plants, and from that, all kinds of negative repercussions happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So this book took you many years. It's a long.
It was a 10-year project.
A 10-year.
Yeah, it wasn't constant tenure, because I produced another book during that period, Island Bats, because I got interested in island biogeography, and at the end of my career at the University of Miami, I was doing bat evolutionary studies with my graduate students on phyllostomid bats in the Caribbean, but that's a whole nother story.
Yes, and so it shows that for the young generation, that also show that not everyone should take some time also to study, to observe. You've been a long time in the field. Now people want to stay there for a few hours, days, weeks, but not like you, years in the field.
Years in the
What
field.
do you think about this acceleration? People want to do work and publish very rapidly. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm against it, because my feeling is that the long-term studies are the ones that are going to have the lasting value. And to do long-term studies, it requires dedication. I have to say it requires dedication, hardship in some cases, I've told the whole story of my professional career in a memoir that was published 10 years ago, and somebody that wrote a little review of this said, it's just amazing to know what the story behind all these papers really involved, how Fleming's family was involved, how they reacted to all of this hardship and so forth, my being gone or their being in the field, living in a tent, living in a VW camper van. You know, that's what it takes. It's easier these days, but nonetheless, science isn't necessarily better. We can ask deeper questions with more sophisticated tools, for sure. But still, there's nothing like really getting to know your organisms, whether they're plants or animals. Really helps to know your organisms very well.
And last small question. I'm not going to ask you what is your favorite seed disperser. I know it. What is your alternative preferred seed disperser?
Well, my favorite bat, which I've been studying, of all the bats I've studied in the world, has to be my pollen disperser, which is also a seed disperser, the lesser long-nosed bat. Very smart, very easy to handle. I filmed them under controlled conditions. We've just done a Disney nature film starring these bats. So, I have to say that that's my favorite bat of all. Of the seed dispersers, I'm not sure. They're all nasty bats. They like to bite. I like Corollia. I got to know Corollia very well, so that's a really nice bat too.
So finally a mouse get interested in bats.
Yes, that's right. I graduated from rodent ecology to bat ecology, plant-animal interactions. It's been a really fun career.
Thank you.